back to the proper method of financing our federal government, which is tariffs.
Yep. Well, this is
originally there was to be no direct tax.
yeah. They're what people don't realize. They say, "Oh gosh, free trade's wonderful." There is no free trade. All these nations have stealth tariffs. They're tariffs. I mean, Germany has a 19% tariff. China, 17% tariff. They just don't call it that. They call it a border-adjusted tax. All you do, you replace the current system, and we would have an 8% border-adjusted tax. And it's all permissible under WTO. In fact, France started this. I talk about the second part of the book. There's a chapter called Putting America Back to Work. And the second part of the book, it was France that figured out, hey, we're going to give an advantage to our domestic manufacturers, and they started this in the 1960s, and everybody picked up on it. We're running trade deficits with 90 nations. The manufacturing trade deficit from 2000 to 2008 was $5.4 trillion. I mean, we're killing ourselves, and I don't know why our folks aren't talking about it. Now, you know, it's great for the foreign nations because we're a wonderful dumping ground for them. And it's great for the Wall Street private equity moguls because debt is deductible under the current system, so they can come in, load companies up with debt, leverage them, downsize them, send jobs overseas, flip the companies in a couple of years. They make a lot of money, but it's not good for the long-term health of the American economy or the American workers. And so you turn the system upside down. I don't know if I have the quote. You know, I just did a piece recently on changing from a kind of a debt-driven tax system to a production-driven tax system. But Mark Faber, one of the leading investment minds in the country, points out, you know, you've got to have a tax system that rewards productivity, manufacturing, growth in the U.S. And capital investment is punitively taxed here. Employment's punitively taxed. If you change it to border-adjusted business consumption tax, all of a sudden that's not taxed. All that money that's parked overseas could come back in, and as long as it's put into capital investment, you're allowed to expense capital investment under this proposed 8% business consumption tax.
What frustrates me is Americans are paying for the roads, the harbors, the Coast Guard, everything, the highways,
right,
and they come in and just use it for nothing.
Absolutely. And look, General Electric, they've already paid corporate taxes. They've moved facilities overseas. Guess what? As they bring those goods back in under this system, they got to pay. They got to pay 8%. And all those service jobs, many of which have migrated to India. I was over in eastern Iowa in Dubuque, where now they're beginning to see the problems of outsourcing, the quality, the lack of control of your own technology. So some of that's coming back in. But you change the tax system where they're not paying a 7.5% employer portion of the payroll tax. You don't have a corporate income tax. And by the way, your services over there coming into the U.S. are taxed at 8%. They're going to come home immediately. I mean, this is a great time to rebuild the manufacturing base because you've got supply chain issues, as we just saw with the Japanese situation. You've got the cost of energy, shipping from Asia, wages are lower, but by the way, you've got long-term inventory lead times versus short-term lead times if it's here. But all of those are helpful, but the thing that'll push it over the top if you change the way you tax business and you make it revenue neutral, the irony is it'll start growing the revenue once you start growing the private sector again. So you're growing the economy, and then if you do the second piece of it, which is to attack the spending side, all of a sudden this thing starts moving in the right direction. Our trade deficits come down, which are significant. We just announced $53 billion this last month, $50 billion the month before. It also lessens our dependence on foreign energy because it's an incentive for domestic energy production and also rewards exports of energy.
This is designed just to replace the corporate income tax.
Yeah, it would start there. I don't think you can do everything at once. I know there are people that want to, I think you've got to be realistic. This is a time, this is a way to do it. Yes, sir.
But in doing that,
right,
you also can eliminate that whole segment of the IRS that handles
absolutely
corporate income tax.
It's gone.
All the people, all the rules,
it's all gone.
all that goes away.
Absolutely.
And the lobbying for special tax rates
It all
goes
goes
away
away.
as well.
You're absolutely right.
So you.
Targeted exceptions.
Yeah, you not only cut out the bureaucracy, but you
Right.
cut out the lobbying for
Absolutely.
tax breaks.
Oh, yeah.
It's
And
like,
all of a
there
sudden,
aren't any taxes.
and it
so get out of
begins
here.
to change, and it addresses this whole other issue of this enormous concentration of power that's moved to Washington DC,
Right.
and it begins to unravel that, you know?
Yeah. That's why nobody's talking about it.
No, no.
The reality is because they want the power.
Sure.
That's why the tax code is so complex.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And this is a way to get it done, and you know, there are other approaches. What I like about the Hartman plan, and the guy who's the architect of it is a retired businessman, ran manufacturing companies in the Midwest, migrated to Texas, very successful entrepreneur. He got my attention a number of years ago, started showing me some of these figures, and he said it's unsustainable and it's gotten worse since he mentioned. I mean,
Right.
even under Republican administration, the last 10 years, 1/3, that's 5.5 million American manufacturing jobs have gone away. Recently, Wall Street Journal reported of the US-based multinational companies, which provide 20% of the private sector jobs directly. Now, how many more indirectly? Over the last decade, they have cut 2.9 million jobs here in the US, and they've added 2.4 million jobs overseas. Again, this is a tax system designed to export almost, you know, it has the inevitable result of exporting
Right.
prosperity and jobs overseas.
With support from Paul Ryan and Jim DeWitt, what other legislative support do you have?
Well, that's a great, you know, I've been on the phone with Ryan. I have not talked to him personally.
Thank you.
The guy who's the leading talk show in his district, Mitch Hank, loves this idea. He has me on about once every 2 weeks promoting it. People need to understand this. Ryan's, I talked to his tax accountant. I said, look, I know we got to deal with the austerity side, but tell your guy we got to also grow the private sector. You got to give people hope that it's not simply a declining economy, that it's inevitable that we lose and the Chinese win. And they believe in it, but they haven't carved out specific legislation. My own Texas delegation, it's one of the reasons I'm here. I'm just tired. I've gone to the Texas delegation, and they all said, that's a good idea. Go get somebody else to introduce it. And nobody wants to really push it. And pardon me?
You talked to Steve King?
No, I haven't talked to him about that. Yeah, he'd be a good idea to do that. But it's,
Then he does.
We're fighting Kmart, Walmart, Menard, I mean, you know,
would
they
they
don't,
be against it?
absolutely,
Well, let me
because
tell
they're
you why
buying
they
cheap.
might, let me tell you why they might not. A, you don't have to pay, under this proposal, it's revenue neutral, brings in just as much as the current system. They wouldn't have to pay the 7.5% employer portion of the payroll tax. Number one, they wouldn't have to pay corporate income tax. So the cost to the consumers, I mean, yeah, they're paying 8%.
So their prices can
Their
come down.
prices can, it's
Can stay
offset.
neutral.
Yeah, it could stay neutral. It's offset because it's a more favorable tax system here, and it's also then an incentive for them to start doing what Sam Walton did way back when, start buying more in America.
Right.
You know. So I think that as long as you do something with the employer portion of the payroll tax, include this with the 35% rate, because a lot of these retail operations pay the maximum. I mean, yeah, they work the system like everybody else does, but I think it could be sold to them.
Hard to get rid of that 7.5%. They get that on all their employees.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, so
Yeah.
this would be this is a real incentive for them to take a look at it. Now, unions, I got some all these fat cap corporate guys, but then I say to them, hey guys, look at you're losing your workforce overseas, and you better do something. So there's an openness with the labor folks as well, and there's more and more talk and willingness to entertain this idea. I feel a little bit like my friend, the late Jack Kemp in the 70s. I mean, you know, he was out there beating the drums for his idea with what became Kemp-Roth Job Creation Act. It took Ronald Reagan to get elected to put it in place, and he got bipartisan support year one. And I think this is the type of idea and concept that can get bipartisan support.
So this would have to be tied with somehow funding Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah, doesn't
Now
it?
the
Yeah.
employer isn't matching.
Well, no, because it raises, there's no loss to Social Security because the new business consumption tax pays for that. In other words, the employer portion. I keep the employee portion of the payroll tax. but the employer portion is made up for by the business consumption tax. You have to have transition, but you make sure that the revenues you get cover that, plus get you revenues that are comparable to what you're getting today. It probably is like what we did with Kemp Roth. It may take 3 years to fully implement, but then it's a clean system. I mean, you know how the tax system's going to work, as opposed to all these targeted exceptions and the complicated IRS corporate code, which somebody was giving me the number of pages the other day. It's totally out of control. So no, in Protect, there is no loss to Social Security, Medicare. In fact, as you grow the revenues, it will actually probably be helpful in terms of the solvency of those programs.
How's that gonna work with the World Trade Organization and
They're all-
export of the agricultural crops?
Not a problem at all, because all of this is all being done under WTO by other nations. It's approved by WTO. And it should be good for agriculture, quite frankly, because exports, under the business consumption tax, companies exporting get a credit against their tax, and goods coming into the U.S. would have to pay 8%. So it should be beneficial to our agricultural interests. And those, nations like Brazil and others that may be sending products into the U.S., they would, it depends on if it's a final product or if there's value added. But it is perfectly permissible under WTO and all these other nations. I think over 100 have comparable tax systems, and it gives them a huge advantage over us. Canada has, to our north, has one. It's a sliding scale. I think it's 5 to 13. But
Any more questions?
On the energy side,
right.
just to come back to that, one of the problems we have obviously is the environmental activism, not real environmentalism, but the activism. Can't a president declare that it's a national security issue and get rid of a lot of that? Energy. It is a national security issue. But I mean, just shut down a lot of the lawsuits that are.
Well, the
frivolous.
lawsuits, the regulatory, here's the problem. You've got two fronts. What we did in the Reagan administration was a strong regulatory team that moved immediately to address all the regulations.
Right.
And is the value such, as opposed to the damage to business,
Exactly.
measuring
Right.
on balance, if it wasn't justified, they got rid of it.
And this administration says if we can damage business, we
No,
want to.
absolutely. It's like throwing a monkey
right,
wrench in.
right.
This isn't true environmentalism. It's like
Right,
throwing a
right.
monkey wrench into the economy. It's a long-term plan.
Yes.
Whether you call it state capitalism or whatever, or social, it's a move towards concentration of power. And a few big companies then who play the game, you get your waivers on Obamacare, you get this, and you get benefits. If you play ball, if you do not, you pay a price. I think one of the problems, you've got these federal judges who are in effect making social policy. I don't
Right.
care whether it was Roe v. Wade, I don't care whether it's on some of these environmental cases. In Texas, they basically imposed, we had a liberal federal judge who imposed a racial-based gerrymandering plan on Dallas. I fought it in Dallas, we defeated him, we won at the polls, and he put it right back in. The arrogance of these guys. What you've got to do, the irony is, I talk about it in the book, on a lot of these questions, they're political questions, and Congress could essentially say, on political questions, you limit jurisdiction of the federal courts, they need to be resolved by the legislative bodies, not by the courts. So you could avoid these sort of, look, liberal activists know which courts to go to, where to file. That would be the approach that I think would be a better approach, to limit jurisdiction over that. I'm wary about executive orders or your overturning.
Yep.
I think a better approach is and we had this issue crop up on the abortion question when I was in the Reagan administration. There were two approaches. One was what ultimately became known as the Hatch Amendment. The other was from Senator John East, the late Senator John East, who offered, his basic approach was on Roe v. Wade, simply say that this issue of abortion is a political question, needs to be resolved by the legislative bodies, take away jurisdiction from the courts over it, and let the legislative bodies make the determination. We didn't go with that approach. I think that was a mistake, retrospect. I don't know who made the call on that, because you're never gonna get a constitutional amendment through. I mean, it's fine, worth trying to be like that on EPA or other issues. So I think this approach of limiting jurisdiction of these federal judges who are not, they're making law, not interpreting laws away, because you can't impeach, I mean, you're not gonna be able to get support to impeach them. The way is to take the power in areas like this away from them, but I think Congress ought to do it.
So you see in the current field of people running for president, that type of leader that you've been describing?
I'm not involved in the presidential campaign, so I don't, you know, there are a lot of good people.
But do you have a personal opinion that there's somebody in that group?
I'm just not, you know, I don't even know who's gonna be in it yet. I mean, you've got some other people that are being mentioned at the moment. I've been out trying to, you know, we have Americans for a Conservative President, but we're more a declaration of principles. Here are the ideas we're talking about and trying to get people interested in. So I'm staying neutral in the presidential race. Yes, ma'am.
Under the Clinton administration, Glass-Steagall was repealed
That's right.
by the Graham Leach, was it Biley?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And now we have Dodd-Frank's.
Yeah, terrible.
Terrible. And with the too big to fail and the credit default swaps and everything else that has come down, where are we, or how are we going to get integrity back into the banking
Great.
and investing system?
Great question, and I'm sorry I didn't, I cover it in the book, but I didn't cover it this morning. I think it was a huge mistake. Obviously, that push came from Sandy Wheel at Citibank. He got Phil Graham, who later went to work for UBS. They've got Robert Rubin, who had been Secretary of Treasury. And I talk about in the book, the first bailouts began in the Clinton administration, and obviously it was a repeal of Glass-Steagall, which I think was a mistake. But the first bailouts in the began in the Clinton administration when the Wall Street traders got on the wrong side in a risky credit derivative trade on the Mexican peso. And so, in effect, what Rubin did is, they're too big to fail, so we better make them whole. So they got 100 cents on their dollar on their risky trades. I use the example in the book, and then it was continued with Henry Paulson in the Bush administration with the too big to fail bailout in 2008. And I use the term in the book, a friend of mine actually used it, so I borrowed it from him, but I call it privatization of the gain, socialization of the risk. If the risky trades work out, they get the benefit of it. If they don't, then you put it on to the American taxpayers, and that's crony capitalism. That's not a free market economy at work. So if they're too big to fail, they're too big. But I'll tell you what we have to do. A conservative president, conservative administration ought to bring in, and I recommend, if you get it, you can Google it. It's Conventional Fed Wisdom Defied by Gretchen Morgeson, August 13, 2011, New York Times. Interview with Thomas Hoenig. I don't know if you know who he is. He's the president of the Fed in Kansas City, Hoenig, and he's about to be the former president of the Fed. This is a guy who was born in Iowa. Where was he born in Iowa? Fort Madison. Vietnam veteran, interesting guy. I've exchanged letters with him. I don't know him personally, but he's a guy that warned of what Greenspan was doing by keeping interest rates artificially low. He's dissented from Bernanke's keeping interest rates artificially low, and this sort of us buying the money. He's been very critical. He was critical. He warned that the credit excess that was leading up in the wake of the repeal of Glass-Steagall was going to lead to the bursting of a bubble. He was right then. He's warning that Dodd-Frank doesn't do anything about this situation except make it worse and more complicated. And this is the kind of person. In fact, he has a line which but I do quote him. He says, "We've had a Secretary of Treasury in a Democratic administration from Goldman Sachs," that was Robert Rubin, a Secretary of Treasury from Goldman Sachs in a Republican administration, Henry Paulson, and in neither case has it worked out all that well for the country. So I think if they're too big to fail, they're too big. And I worry that we're going to see that crop up again, the way things are going, and it's not being addressed. But again, you've got such powerful money. And the AIG bailout, which I talk about in the book, and Gretchen Morgenson was the first one that got my attention on it. She wrote about it. You had a transfer of $80 billion from the American taxpayers to AIG. You get a new chairman of AIG who comes off the Goldman Sachs board. That money then is turned around and immediately transferred to the folks on the other side of the credit derivative trade so that they get 100 cents on the dollar. $13 billion to Goldman Sachs, who had some of their best quarters ever after, you know, getting their bailout money later. European institutions and U.S. financial institutions. They got paid 100 cents on the dollar. When Lehman went busted, according to Barron's Magazine, the credit derivative trades on the wrong side got about 15 cents on the dollar. When Enron, which I talk about in my book, went busted, it wasn't an energy company in Texas. When it went bankrupt, it was an energy credit derivatives trading company, and the folks on the other side of those trades got about 15 cents on the dollar. I mean, this stuff is just outrageous. And there's a documentary called Inside Job, and it's very good. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's absolutely, it is who are the people working for. You got to clean the stables out. You got to bring in independent. I don't know that this man's a conservative. I think he is, but he sure knows. I like what he has to say. These are the kind of people you got to bring into Washington who know the games that are being played and clean it out.
Ewing Geithner, his name is mentioned.
Oh yeah, he's a protege of Robert Rubin.
Yeah. Well, Gretchen Morgenson has written book Reckless Endangerment.
I haven't read it yet. I want to read it. She's very good. She's very good. She actually worked for Forbes in his campaign a long time ago.
Yes. What's the name of the article again?
Oh, here it is. Conventional Fed Wisdom Defied, August 13, 2011, by Gretchen Morgenson, Morgenson, in the New York Times. And it's Thomas Hoenig, if you Google it, Thomas Hoenig, Hoenig. And it is really, it's an interview with him, and it really, I'm glad you brought that subject up, because the Glass-Steagall, he addresses, you know, that issue.
Can we go back to that?
Thank you very much.